My name is Mara Quinn, and I'm 26. Until 6 weeks ago, I was the kind of person you pass on the street and never think about again. Quiet kindergarten teacher, paycheck to paycheck, tiny walk-up apartment with a stubborn radiator. The only reason I never felt poor was because I had been raised rich in the ways that actually count. My grandparents, Eleanor and Howard Bennett, gave me a home stitched from small rituals. Fresh cookies cooling on a wire rack, tomatoes warm from the vine, long walks where Grandpa taught me that success is the harvest of patience, not the parade of purchases. They had real money, quiet money, and even quieter habits. If you'd seen them, you'd never guess there was an 8-figure fortune behind the coupons Grandma clipped, or the 20-year-old truck Grandpa affectionately called Rusty Duke. Their rule for me was simple. Money is a tool, Mara, Grandma would say, not a scoreboard. It should build, not boast. When they died in a crash caused by a drunk driver, I thought grief would be the hardest part. It wasn't. The hardest part began 2 weeks later, in a paneled office that smelled faintly of citrus oil and paper, with the reading of a will that detonated my family. The Bennetts built Bennett Transit, a logistics firm that grew from one truck in the late 1970s to a regional fleet by the time I was born. They never made a show of it. I spent weekends at their modest 4-bedroom on 3 acres, garden rows straight as sheet music, a little greenhouse that looked like a crystal chapel in winter. They were at every school play my parents missed, every scrimmage, every parent-teacher night, even when I became the teacher. My parents were present but distant, like expensive furniture covered in plastic. There, but unable to be touched. My father, Robert, worked 55-hour weeks chasing titles. My mother, Lydia, orbited charity luncheons with people who addressed each other by the names of their foundations. We were a family of full calendars and empty dinners. I learned to fill my own plate at the Bennetts. There had always been friction between my father and his parents. He grew up expecting the vault to open simply because he shared their last name. When he demanded a senior post at their company without a day of operations experience, Grandpa said the 2 words that built the entire business: earn it. That was the fracture. Dad left for a shiny corporate job and never forgave them for loving principle more than pride. For me, it was different. They paid for my education so I could choose passion over profit without debt handcuffing me. When I chose kindergarten, they cheered like I'd won a prize. They'd sneak me practical gifts, snow tires, a blender that could crush a glacier, but never once tried to buy my decisions. 6 weeks ago, a Tuesday evening, I was grading handwriting worksheets when a number I didn't recognize called. A calm voice said the words that reroute a life. There was an accident. I was told they likely didn't feel the thing. It's strange how something meant as comfort can feel like a hammer. The funeral passed like a soundproof montage, lips moving, flowers appearing, strangers hugging too long. My brother, Justin, 24, flew in from California and spent most of the service scrolling. Aunt Paula cried loudly when cameras were visible and went quiet when they weren't. Uncle Owen stood at the edges like a man waiting for an elevator that never came. None of them had visited the Bennetts in years, yet they curated grief as if it were an event. 2 weeks later, came a call from Martin Gold, their attorney. He asked that we all gather for the will. I arrived early, black dress, black umbrella. Grandma insisted I keep one in my car because rain never RSVPs. Martin met me with a soft handshake. He's compact, neat, late 50s maybe, with silver at his temples and a voice that folds around hard truths without sugarcoating them. He said, "I'm sorry, Mara. Eleanor's lemon bars were a bribe, but I kept consulting just for those." It made me smile for the first time in days, which almost made me cry again. The door swung open and my family spilled in like a weather front. Dad led with hurry in his shoes, checking his watch as if time owed him interest. Mom followed, polished to a high gloss, her handbag the price of a semester's tuition. Justin wore sunglasses indoors, his version of solemn, shirt half tucked. Aunt Paula spoke to her phone about a charity gala snub, voice pitched for eavesdroppers. Uncle Owen trailed, polite nodding, eyes anywhere but mine. "Let's keep this efficient," Dad said, not bothering with hello. Martin's smile thinned. We took our places around a heavy table that looked reclaimed from a courthouse. Dad claimed one end as if authority arrived with furniture. I sat near Martin. Everyone else formed their usual alliances. My mother glued to Dad's flank, Justin beside her, Paula across, like a well-coiffed general, Owen stationed near retreat. Martin began with the legal overture, revocations, executors, all the scaffolding of a will. Then he reached the part that sucked the oxygen out of the room. Eleanor and Howard Bennett bequeathed the entire estate, cash, investments, real property, including their primary residence, and their 25% stake in Bennett Transit, to their granddaughter, Mara Quinn. Silence. Not the polite kind, the vacuum kind. For clarity, Martin continued, they intentionally make no provision for their son, Robert Bennett, their daughter-in-law, Lydia Bennett, their grandson, Justin Bennett, their daughter, Paula Reeves, or their son-in-law, Owen Reeves. They documented their reasons with me over many years. Dad shot to his feet so fast, his chair skittered back. "Let me see that." He scanned the page like it might apologize. Absurd. She's a teacher. She can't manage $26 million. Mom's voice sweetened until it stuck to your shoes. "Mara, darling, this isn't right. They were confused. The family is the family. We'll help you handle it." Justin slapped the table. "What about me? I've got ventures. Seed capital doesn't manifest." I stared at him. Justin has never held a job longer than a season. His last app raided public restrooms and burned $50,000 of my parents' money before collapsing under its own absurdity. Aunt Paula cut in. "The house belongs with us. School's in that district. My kids will thrive." Martin touched my elbow. "You don't have to decide today." We adjourned to chaos. Threats of court, hissed promises, flimsy hugs that smelled like perfume and strategy. Martin pressed a thick envelope in my hands, keys, contacts, instructions, and I fled to my car with the feeling that what should have been a blessing had turned predatory.
That night, at my parents' demand, I showed up at their 5,000 square foot showpiece of stone and glass. The living room was staged like a magazine spread and felt just as hospitable. Dad stood by the fireplace with a scotch. Mom perched on a chair like a bird guarding an egg. Justin sprawled across the couch. Paula paced. Owen stared through the window as if maps were hidden in the dark. "Sit," Dad said. His tone made it clear. Hearing was not the same as being heard. "We'll be reasonable," he began, which meant he wouldn't. "You sign the estate to me. I'll distribute fairly. You keep 10%. The rest stays where it belongs, with the family." I read the transfer Justin printed, legalese broad enough to swallow daylight. It gave Dad control and promised me a percentage at his discretion. He slid a pen across. "No," I said. The room jolted. Dad's glass cracked in his hand. Mom launched into opera about gratitude. Justin sneered and predicted how quickly money vanishes when held by the uninitiated. Paula rehearsed renovations for a home she had never visited. Through it all, the word "no" stood between me and the table like a guard. Dad moved closer, pointing. "Sign or be out. You don't get the fortune and the family. Choose." "I'm choosing our grandparents' wishes," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "Get out," he snarled. "Tonight." "I have my own apartment," I said. He laughed, a sound like a door locking. "We own that building through a holding company. Lease terminated." Mom checked her watch. 30 minutes to gather your essentials. Locks change in the morning. Shock slows time. I packed on autopilot. Documents, toiletries, a week of clothes, the quilt Grandma made me from her old sundresses. Dad watched from the doorway like a guard counting minutes. Mom called a realtor about our parents' house,
before I'd zipped my bag. Justin leaned in the hall with a smirk. "Enjoy freezing on your mountain of cash." At the door, Mom said, "Family is forever, Mara. You'll regret this." "I'm not the one throwing it away," I answered, and stepped into the cool night. The door shut behind me with the weight of something ending. I sat in my old, faithful car and cried until I couldn't see the dash. I cried for what I'd lost and for what had been revealed. Then I remembered Martin's envelope. Inside was a rabbit-shaped keychain I knew by heart and the keys it held. The Bennett's front door. Their house, my house now, waited under a porch light Grandpa had set on a timer long ago. I drove there on muscle memory, parked and sat for a while, listening to the kind of silence that presses against your ribs. The key turned smoothly. The smell met me first. Lemon oil and wood polish, the scent of every Sunday of my childhood. I half expected to hear Grandma humming. Instead, light spilled across empty rooms that still felt full. I dropped my bag in the guest room I'd always used. The book on the nightstand still wore my bookmark. Fresh towels waited, folded by hands I would never hold again. I lay down on the quilt I'd brought and cried until sleep finally found me, the way it always did in this house. Soft, patient, inevitable. Morning came bright and disorienting. Reality rushed back with the buzz of my phone. Missed calls, texts stacked like threats. From Mom, "We can resolve this if you're reasonable." From Dad, "24 hours before we file." From Justin, "Enjoy the house, not for long." A chill moved through me. I forwarded the messages to Martin. His reply arrived at once. "Stay put. I'll be there in 30. Don't open the door to anyone else." And for the first time since the reading, I felt something like safety. Martin arrived exactly 30 minutes later, punctual as a metronome, carrying a briefcase and 2 steaming coffees. I met him at the door in the same wrinkled dress I'd slept in, eyes swollen from the night before. Without a word, he handed me one of the cups and followed me into the kitchen, the same sunlit space where my grandparents had once played morning chess over toast. "Drink," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're safe here, Mara. They can't touch this property." I clutched a mug like it was an anchor. "They threw me out last night. I didn't think they'd actually do it." "They did," he said, evenly. "And that's exactly why your grandparents planned for this." He laid a folder on the table and flipped it open. Inside were deeds, trust documents, and a separate property title. 5 years ago, Eleanor bought a small cottage in your name through a blind trust. She wanted to ensure you'd have a home if things ever went wrong. They anticipated your father might use financial leverage against you. Tears stung my eyes again, but these were different. Part grief, part awe. They really thought of everything. Martin nodded. They knew your father's tendencies, and they also knew you might feel isolated, which is why they made other provisions. He paused as a knock came at the back door, right on cue. I frowned. "Who?" "Someone you should meet." When I opened the door, a man stood there holding a tool belt and his hat respectfully in both hands. He looked about 50, with salt and pepper hair and steady brown eyes that carried the calm of someone used to fixing more than fences. "Miss Mara," he said with a soft accent. "I'm Carlos Alvarez. I worked for your grandparents 15 years. They asked me to look after the property and after you if anything happened." Something in me cracked at the kindness in his tone. "Thank you, Carlos. I don't even know where to start." He smiled faintly. "You start by eating something. Mrs. Bennett always said no one can think on an empty stomach." He set a grocery bag on the counter. Fresh bread, eggs, fruit. He must have brought it earlier that morning. Martin chuckled. That woman would have approved of him keeping that promise. Carlos joined us at the kitchen table. Over the next hour, he told stories I had never heard. about how Grandpa would sneak out to the warehouse to deliver Christmas bonuses personally, how Grandma once spent an entire weekend cooking for every driver stuck during a blizzard. Listening, I realized how deeply my grandparents had been loved, not just by me, but by the people whose lives they had quietly improved. Then Carlos grew serious. "There's something you should know. The night after the funeral, your father and brother came here. They said they needed to collect some personal items for safekeeping." He hesitated. "I didn't stop them because I didn't want confrontation while you were grieving. But I reviewed the security cameras later. They took jewelry, watches, and a few electronics." My stomach tightened. They robbed their own parents' home? They didn't know Mr. Bennett replaced the old security system. Your father's version had blind spots. The new one doesn't. Everything's recorded and backed up to the cloud. Martin's eyes sharpened. "That footage will be very useful if they follow through with their threats." Carlos nodded. "There's more. Mrs. Bennett kept journals. Dozens. She wrote everything, especially about family visits. You'll find them in her study." We walked together down the hall to Grandma's small writing room. It smelled faintly of lilac and old ink. On a built-in bookshelf, rows of leather-bound notebooks lined up like sentinels. Each one was dated. Carlos pulled one from the middle and handed it to me. "Start with this one, the entries from last year." I sat on the window seat and opened it. The pages bloomed with her familiar cursive. May 12th. Robert visited after 7 months. Began with small talk, quickly asked for an investment opportunity, cryptocurrency again. Howard refused. Robert called us naive, said we were playing favorites with Mara. If only he knew, she's the one person who's never asked us for a dime. I flipped through more pages, each one a quiet record of disappointment. Missed birthdays, broken promises, thinly veiled requests for money. Then contrasting entries about me. Mara brought a pie today, burned crust but delicious. She stayed to help plant zucchini. Howard said it was his best day in weeks. The words blurred through my tears. They had seen everything. They had known who cared and who didn't. They hadn't been confused at all. They'd been heartbreakingly clear. A knock echoed through the house, again, softer this time. Carlos went to answer. He returned with an older woman wearing a cardigan and sensible shoes. Her face lit up when she saw me. "Mara, my word, you've grown since I last saw you as a teenager. I'm Dorothy Jenkins, your grandparents' housekeeper for 20 years. She hugged me before I could react. "They adored you, sweetheart." I managed a shaky smile. "They adored you too." Dorothy set a tin of cookies on the counter. Oatmeal raisin, Eleanor's recipe. I baked them last night. Somehow I knew you'd be here today.
It felt like the house itself had a pulse again. Over the next several hours, people arrived one by one, each a thread in the tapestry my grandparents had woven. Rosa Martinez, their business partner, confident and sharp-eyed, brought binders explaining the structure of Bennett Transit and how their shares were now mine. George Patel, their investment advisor, arrived with spreadsheets and portfolio summaries, reassuring me that most assets were locked in trusts resistant to legal tampering. Sarah Johnson, the neighbor who'd lived across the road for 3 decades, came with a casserole and soft stories about Sunday picnics and community drives. By mid-afternoon, the living room was full of people who truly cared, not for what I'd inherited, but for who I was to the Bennetts. Each offered comfort, guidance, and loyalty. I felt something that had been missing since the funeral: belonging. While Dorothy dusted the study, she found a hidden drawer in Grandma's desk. Inside were sealed letters and a small USB drive. "She kept these safe," Dorothy said quietly, handing them to Martin. "She didn't trust your father's intentions." Martin examined them carefully. "Look at this. Video files labeled post-funeral security footage. Smart woman." Carlos frowned. That was the night your mother came through the back door, said she was looking for something sentimental. Dorothy sighed. Jewelry box was lighter after that. Martin tucked the drive into his case. All documented. If they try to claim confusion, this will prove otherwise. By 4 o'clock, we were gathered around the dining table. Documents, journals, coffee cups everywhere. When my phone buzzed. The message was from Justin. Hope you're enjoying Grandma's house while it lasts. Dad, Mom, Aunt Paula, Uncle Owen, and I are coming tomorrow at 10 to collect what's ours. Don't try to stop us. I showed Martin. His face darkened. Threatening entry and property seizure. This crosses into criminal territory. What do we do? I asked. He took a deep breath. We activate the final safeguard. The what? Your grandparents predicted this exact outcome. He pulled out his phone and began making rapid calls, leaving clipped instructions. By tomorrow morning, there will be witnesses, legal, civic, and personal, here to ensure everything stays above board. Let them come. We'll be ready. He closed his briefcase with a decisive click and looked at me. Eleanor and Howard didn't just leave you wealth, Mara. They left you protection, allies, and proof. Now you must stand firm and honor that trust. When he and the others left for the night, Carlos remained as guardian. As dusk fell, the house glowed softly, every lamp a small promise of safety. I sat at the dining table, surrounded by journals and papers, reading entry after entry about the grandparents I thought I already knew, discovering new dimensions of their kindness and strategy. They hadn't just loved me, they had prepared me. At 10:07 p.m., another message arrived from Justin. Better sleep with one eye open, tomorrow's going to be fun. Instead of fear, I felt a cold clarity settle over me. For years, they had assumed I was the quiet one, the easy one. Tomorrow, they'd find out how wrong they were. Dawn broke cold and clear, the kind of morning where the air feels sharper than thought. I had barely slept. Every creak in the house had stirred me, every imagined car engine outside had sent my heart racing. But when I rose, something inside me was steel. Not fear anymore, but resolve. I brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead, then stood by the kitchen window watching the sun ignite the dew across my grandparents' garden. The same garden where Grandpa taught me patience. Growth doesn't answer to impatience, Mara. You plant, you water, you wait. By 8 o'clock, Martin's car rolled up the drive. He stepped out with that calm, deliberate energy lawyers seem to absorb from decades of storms. He carried 2 folders and a bag of pastries. We'll need both fuel and paperwork today, he said, his tone brisk but reassuring. Carlos was already up, sweeping the porch, though it hardly needed sweeping. Dorothy arrived next, her arms full of groceries and the steady confidence of someone who had weathered a lifetime of Bennett family tempests. Rosa and George came soon after, Rosa with her laptop and a neat stack of company files, George with a folder of notarized documents and the subtle air of quiet strategy. The kitchen hummed with controlled activity. Dorothy set out bacon, eggs, and coffee, as if we were preparing for a family brunch instead of a battle. Rosa stationed herself at the dining table, connecting her laptop to a small projector. Carlos checked the exterior cameras twice. Even the house seemed to brace itself, the silence between movements heavy with expectation. At 9:30, Martin looked at me over coffee. They'll arrive early. Bullies always do. They mistake impatience for power. He wasn't wrong. At 9:45 sharp, the crunch of tires on gravel echoed through the property. I glanced out the window. 5 vehicles in convoy, gleaming like a parade of vanity. My father's black Mercedes at the front, my mother's pristine white SUV behind, then Aunt Paula's crimson convertible that screamed insecurity louder than any horn, Uncle Owen's gray sedan dutifully trailing, and finally Justin's obnoxiously loud sports car. They're early, Carlos muttered. Let them be. They'll find we're ready. The first knock wasn't a knock at all. It was a pounding, sharp enough to rattle the stained glass on the entryway door. Carlos opened it, stepping aside, but not back. "Good morning," he said, his voice polite but firm. My father stood in the doorway,
jaw tight, eyes scanning the house behind Carlos. "Where is she? This is a family matter. You can leave." Carlos didn't move. "Miss Mara is expecting you. Come in." They filled in, their perfume, cologne, and self-righteousness filling the space like fog. My mother's gaze swept the foyer, landing on me with icy disdain. "You've brought witnesses?" she asked, noticing the crowd behind me. "Observers," Martin corrected, "and in some cases, legal authorities." Right on cue, the door behind them opened again. Judge Robert Henley entered first, tall, gray-haired, and sharp-eyed, a longtime friend of my grandparents. Beside him was Police Chief Mariah Williams, uniformed but relaxed, her badge glinting in the morning light. And behind them, Thomas Jang, my grandparents' financial auditor of 2 decades, carrying a laptop bag and a face that said he'd rather be anywhere else than refereeing family greed. Dad's composure cracked for just a second. "Judge Henley, I didn't realize." "You didn't realize a lot, Robert. I'm here as a neutral witness at the request of the late Bennetts to ensure their estate is respected." The color drained slightly from my father's face. I remember Grandpa once saying, "A man who fears fairness is already guilty." Now I understood. Mom stepped forward, the smile she wore for fundraisers plastered back on. "Chief Williams, I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. We're only here to collect a few heirlooms, family pieces, that would constitute theft without authorization. I'm here as a friend, but also as a witness should anyone forget the definition of private property." Aunt Paula's expression soured. "Oh, for heaven's sake, this is ridiculous." "Is it?" I said quietly, stepping forward. "Because you're here with a written threat." I lifted my phone, screen glowing, with Justin's text from the night before. "I forwarded this to my lawyer and the police last night." "Seems clear enough." Justin sneered. "You really called the cops on your own family?" "I didn't have to. They came because they respected my grandparents." My father's patience snapped. "Enough of this drama. We're here to settle what's ours. You can't possibly believe you're equipped to handle this inheritance. You're a kindergarten teacher, for God's sake." I smiled faintly. "The will says otherwise." From behind me, Rosa spoke up, her voice firm. "Mr. Bennett, before you proceed, you should know the Bennetts documented everything, financially and legally. I have records of every loan, every request, every email regarding the company and personal assets." Dad's eyes narrowed. "What's your point?" "That the documentation shows your parents provided you with substantial financial support during their lifetime. They considered their obligations to you fulfilled. You signed acknowledgments to that effect. I have copies."
Martin handed my father a folder. "And while you're reviewing that, here are notarized statements from witnesses confirming Eleanor and Howard's mental competence when they signed the will." My father glanced at the documents but didn't take them. "We'll see how valid these are once our lawyers look at them." "Your lawyers?" Judge Henley said mildly. "You might consider the cost before you proceed. Contesting a will with this level of documentation would be both futile and very public." That last word landed like a stone. Public. My father's worst nightmare. Aunt Paula, sensing his falter, turned on me instead. "You manipulated them, didn't you? All those visits, all that fake sweetness. You played the perfect granddaughter until they signed everything over." Before I could answer, Chief Williams interjected. "Mrs. Reeves, I've reviewed portions of Mrs. Bennett's journals myself. They record your visits, or rather, the lack of them, and they mention a pattern of financial demands?" Paula's mouth opened, then shut. Justin stepped forward. "You can't prove anything." "Oh, but we can," Martin said, sliding a flash drive across the table. "Security footage. The night after the funeral, when you and your father entered this house and removed several items, jewelry, electronics, watches. We've backed it up off-site." The silence that followed was surgical. Judge Henley's voice cut through it like a blade. "Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett's wishes were clear.
This property and every asset associated with the estate belongs solely to Mara Quinn. Any attempt to interfere or remove property will be considered criminal. My mother recovered first, her voice trembling between outrage and desperation. We're not criminals. We're family. We just want what's fair. Fairness was already given to you, I said quietly. You just didn't recognize it. Dad's eyes met mine, dark and burning. This isn't over, Mara. Actually, Judge Henley said, stepping forward, it is, legally and morally. My father stood motionless, fists tight, his pride crumbling under the weight of witnesses and evidence. Aunt Paula's glare could have cut glass. Justin's smirk had evaporated. Mom looked everywhere but at me. For a long, tense moment, no one spoke. Then Uncle Owen, silent, kind-eyed Uncle Owen, broke the spell. We should go, he said softly. This isn't a fight we can win. Paula hissed something under her breath, but he guided her toward the door. One by one they followed, deflated, exposed, defeated. My father paused at the threshold. You'll regret alienating your own blood. Blood doesn't make family. Integrity does. And with that, he left. The front door closed with a quiet click. The tension drained from the air like a storm finally breaking. Dorothy exhaled audibly, muttering, Eleanor would have loved to see that. Martin smiled faintly. Justice in its simplest form. I stood still for a moment, the echo of the confrontation still vibrating in my chest. For the first time since their deaths, I didn't feel like the grieving granddaughter or the frightened teacher. I felt like the woman my grandparents believed I could be, strong, principled, and utterly unmovable. Judge Henley clapped a hand on my shoulder. They'd be proud of you, Mara. You didn't just inherit their fortune, you inherited their backbone. Rosa nodded. And now, you can finally decide what kind of legacy you want to build with it. Outside, the last of my family's cars disappeared down the drive. Inside, the house was warm again, alive. Somehow, not with ghosts, but with purpose. After the door latched behind the last of them, the house fell into a quiet so complete I could hear the settling of the floorboards and the hummingbird click of the refrigerator. Relief didn't come as a cheer, it came as a slow unclenching, like frost giving back the ground. Dorothy poured coffee all around as if we'd returned from a long trip, and in a way we had, out of a wilderness I hadn't chosen. Martin slid a neat stack of envelopes toward me. Follow-ups, he said. First, a notice demanding the return of items removed after the funeral. Second, a cease and desist referencing Justin's threats. Third, a letter that sets your boundaries in writing. Read, sign, and I'll courier them this afternoon. I scanned the drafts. Martin's prose carried the weight of law without cruelty. The boundary letter was simple, almost tender in its bluntness. I would honor Eleanor and Howard's wishes. Any relationship with my biological family would require respect for those wishes. Any attempt to coerce, threaten, or circumvent would end contact. I signed all three, my hand steady. Good, he said, gathering the papers. I'll also file temporary restraining orders we can trigger if needed. With the journals, the videos, and today's witnesses, you're shielded. Shielded. Not invincible, but held. Rosa closed her laptop and looked at me. What do you want to build, Mara? She asked. Beyond defense. Your grandparents built all of this not to hoard, but to seed future good. What's your first planting? The question sat between us like a lantern. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked to the kitchen window and stared across the vegetable beds. Grandpa used to trace furrows with his finger and say, "We plant rows, but we're really planting time." I thought about the little hands I guided each day, the parents whose faces carried both hope and worry, the school that scraped by with a budget thinner than notebook paper. School, I said, at last. Kids, teachers, we build the kind of support that would have changed everything for me if I hadn't had the Bennetts.
Rosa smiled like she'd been waiting to hear that. Then let's put the company to work for that future. The rest of the day unfurled as lists and steps. George explained the trusts in plain language and how distributions could be carved for a foundation without tripping tax landmines. Rosa outlined how Bennett Transit's profit-sharing and retirement benefits could be preserved and expanded. Martin compiled minutes from the morning, an immaculate record should any court ever ask. By early evening, the house emptied. The work paused, but not done. Carlos locked the doors and did his quiet rounds. Dorothy left a pan of baked Zito with a note. Heat at 350. Eat even if you feel you can't. I carried the note to the fringe like it was a relic and stuck it under a magnet shaped like a tomato. When night folded over the roof, I sat alone in the dining room. The journals spread like constellations. I reread the entry where Grandma had written, "Mara stayed to help plant zucchini. Howard said it was his best day in weeks." I pressed my palm to the ink as if warmth could travel backward. The next weeks moved like weather. Some days bright with momentum, others gray with paperwork and uninvited memories. Martin couriered my boundary letter. In return, he received 3 distinct replies. From my mother, a brittle email about misunderstandings and optics, with the suggestion that she join the board of whatever charitable endeavor I chose. From my father, a terse acknowledgement laced with veiled threats about future litigation. From Justin, nothing. Just a single middle-of-the-night message. "Borrow me $300K? Short term? We're family." I forwarded it to Martin and let silence answer. We established the Eleanor and Howard Bennett Education Trust with an initial commitment of $10 million, structured to fund scholarships, classroom grants, and emergency assistance for students and teachers. George drafted the endowment policy. Rosa introduced me to a consultant who specialized in equitable grant making. The first meeting of the nascent board, me, Rosa, George, and Martin, in a non-voting legal role, took place at the dining table with Dorothy's lemon bars serving as our parliamentary procedure. I went back to teaching 2 weeks after the showdown, ignoring the quiet chorus of "Why keep working?" from acquaintances who measured purpose in paychecks. In my classroom, we added a reading corner with soft rugs and sturdy shelves. I bought every child a set of crayons not yet blunted by a dozen other hands, and stocked snacks in the cupboard so empty stomachs didn't have to pretend they weren't growling. I paid for it from a separate fund Martin helped me set up. Anonymous, because kids deserve gifts with no strings.
At Bennett Transit, I didn't play executive. I listened. I joined Rosa for weekly walkthroughs, introduced myself to dispatchers and drivers, and asked them, awkwardly at first, then with growing ease, what made their jobs harder and what made them proud. An older driver named Hank told me the profit-sharing checks had helped him keep his mother in her home. A young dispatcher named Priya said flexible schedules let her take night classes. Those were the dividends my grandparents had intended. We codified them. Profit sharing indexed to fuel volatility, a written pledge that benefits wouldn't be the first cuts in lean years, and a committee where employees could propose safety and efficiency improvements for bonuses that weren't insults. The house thawed around me. I moved from the guest room into the master after a month, when the scent of Grandma's lilac finally felt like comfort instead of ache. Carlos and I turned the dry basement into a community room with whiteboards, modular tables, and shelves for supplies. Somewhere to host tutoring, weekend workshops, and, selfishly, Sunday dinners. Dorothy insisted on keeping her schedule, 3 mornings a week, though I begged her to retire. I retired once, she said, batting the air. It didn't take. Sunday dinners returned, not as a substitution for the past, but as a continuation. Rosa brought empanadas that ruined me for all others. Martin arrived with flowers he pretended were from his garden. They weren't. The rubber band was still on the stems. George told stories about his wild 20s and then, mortified, begged us not to repeat them. Carlos's wife, Alma, brought pozole and laughter. Their son, Nico, practiced guitar in the corner and then forgot to be shy and played for us.
We raised glasses to Eleanor and Howard, water, wine, tea, and tried new toasts each time. To good work done quietly, to hands that plant more than they pick, to being the kind of family you choose every day. My biological family's contact didn't stop. It changed shape. Lydia called when a rumor about the trust trickled through her social circle. A seat on your board would demonstrate unity, she suggested, the word unity corseted by PR. I told her board members were chosen for service, not surnames. Robert texted when one of his ventures hit a cash crunch, dressing the ask as an opportunity. I replied that the foundation's funds were restricted, and my personal giving followed two rules. It had to make lives better, and it had to be transparent. Justin resurfaced after a crypto winter, this time pitching a fintech platform reinventing generosity. I declined. He sent the same message 3 more times with different punctuation, as if commas might sweeten rejection. I did not block them. I did not invite chaos to dinner either. Boundaries are bridges with gates. Mine stayed locked except on the rare days when a hard truth arrived with humility. Those days were rare. Months passed. The Trust's first programs moved from paper to life. Classroom microgrants with applications short enough to fit on a phone. Emergency rent support for families 1 paycheck from disaster. A pilot apprenticeship with Bennett Transit for high school seniors not headed to traditional 4-year paths. The day the first checks went out, Dorothy set a bundt cake on the counter like we'd christened a ship. Eleanor would say, "Don't eat the presentation slice," she warned, already cutting it for us. On a crisp afternoon, the color of new pennies, I drove to the cemetery alone. I hadn't returned since the funeral because grief has terrible timing, and I'd been busy fortifying all the rooms it likes to flood. I brought flowers Grandma liked, white tulips and a ridiculous frill of baby's breath because she thought it looked like celebration confetti. I sat on the bench and read them updates as if they were traveling and checking postcards. I said softly, "We did it. Not the whole mountain, but the first switchback. The trust is launched, the company's steady. Your friends still sit around your table and tell on you. They miss you. I do too. In ways that surprise me when I butter toast, and when I choose a light bulb, and when I hear a song you both hated." A breeze fussed with the tulips. Someone down the lane laughed, which felt correct. Cemeteries should be safe places for laughter. I told them about 3 students we'd already approved for full scholarships. One headed to a state college for engineering, one to community college to become a nurse, one to a trade program for HVAC because he liked fixing what people relied on. I told them about Priya's schedule and Hank's mother. I told them about Sunday dinners and Nico's guitar and Dorothy's refusal to retire. And then I told them about my parents without explaining, because the dead don't need footnotes. I said, "I'm keeping the gates shut. If they knock with respect someday, I'll open them." Walking back to the car, I felt less like someone carrying inheritance and more like a gardener with a long season ahead. Soil overturned, seeds tucked in, water can at the ready. The next big thing sat on the calendar in neat letters: scholarship ceremony. 20 seniors, families in folding chairs, a stage we'd borrow from the high school auditorium, and a microphone that would no doubt whistle at the worst moment. I was both terrified and giddy.
The night before the ceremony, I stood in the basement community room, alone with a stack of printed programs and a row of gift bags Dorothy insisted we needed, because paper feels like a receipt, a bag feels like a beginning. I checked the name cards for the 10th time. Maria Vasquez, Tyler Quinn, Aaliyah Brooks, on and on, names that sounded like the future rolling its shoulders. Somewhere upstairs, the clock chimed the hour. I pressed my palms on the table to ground myself and whispered into the empty room, "Okay, you two, I'm ready." For the first time since the crash, I believed it. The auditorium shimmered with anticipation that morning, sunlight glinting off the rows of folding chairs, the smell of freshly waxed floors, the murmur of parents trying to hush restless children. I stood behind the curtain, heart hammering, clutching my note cards though I already knew every word by heart. The Eleanor and Howard Bennett Foundation Scholarship Ceremony wasn't just a milestone, it was the living proof of everything my grandparents had believed in: decency, diligence, and giving quietly without expecting applause. Dorothy was in the front row, proud as a parade, wearing a brooch shaped like a daisy. Carlos sat beside her with his wife and son, who had volunteered to record the ceremony. Rosa adjusted the microphone on stage while Martin reviewed the program, his usual lawyerly calm tinged with something softer, pride maybe, or relief. The stage smelled faintly of pine and possibility. When the announcer called my name, the applause rolled forward like a wave. I stepped into the light, blinking. For a heartbeat, I saw my grandparents there. Grandpa in his favorite plaid shirt, Grandma holding her hands together in that quiet, approving way of hers. And then the faces of 20 students came into focus, each one carrying the future in their eyes. 6 months ago, I stood in a lawyer's office, terrified and heartbroken. I'd lost my grandparents, the people who raised me to believe that money is a tool, not a trophy. What I didn't know was that they had left me more than an inheritance. They left me a responsibility to use what they built for something that lasts. A hush fell over the crowd. Today, I continued, 20 of you will begin your journeys with full scholarships, not because of luck, but because of your courage, hard work, and integrity. You remind me of why they built what they did and why they trusted me to keep building. I paused, letting the moment breathe. My grandparents believed that true wealth isn't what you keep, it's what you give away with purpose. So let this be your beginning, not a gift, but an invitation to become givers yourself, in whatever way you can. The applause came again, but this time I didn't shy away from it. I smiled, not for the cameras, but for them, for Eleanor and Howard Bennett, whose legacy now had 20 new branches. After the speeches, the scholarship recipients lined up for photos. I met each one, shaking hands, sharing hugs. Maria Vasquez, the girl I'd noticed on the list the night before, stood shyly in front of me. She was small, with dark eyes full of light and nerves. "My parents wanted to thank you," she said quietly. "They couldn't be here, they're both working doubles today, but they told me to tell you, you gave them hope again." Tears rose uninvited. "Then tell them that they've given me the same," I said, handing her the envelope with her scholarship letter. "Go make them proud." "I will," she promised, clutching it like something sacred. After the ceremony, Dorothy cornered me with a tissue and a laugh. "You did them proud, honey. If Eleanor were here, she'd be handing out cookies to everyone." "I wish she were," I said softly. "She is," Dorothy replied, tapping her chest. "Right here and right there." She pointed toward the crowd of students now laughing, taking selfies, embracing their parents. "That's her. That's Howard. That's the both of them multiplied." Later that afternoon, when the crowd dispersed and the last folding chair clattered shut, I sat alone on the stage steps. The echo of applause still lingered, but so did something deeper: peace. For the first time, I wasn't living in reaction to loss or defense against greed. I was living forward. That night, the Sunday dinner table was fuller than ever. Carlos grilled in the backyard while his son played guitar under the porch light. Rosa told stories about the first day she worked for Grandma and burned an entire pot roast. Martin argued cheerfully about investment strategies for the foundation, and Martin, to everyone's amusement, spilled wine on his tie for the 3rd time in a row. I looked around and felt the same warmth I used to feel in this house as a child.
laughter echoing against wood beams, the smell of lemon polish and comfort food, the low hum of belonging. My grandparents' chairs sat at the ends of the table, draped with their old garden shawl and cap. I'd placed them there weeks ago, not as shrines, but as symbols, reminders that presence can outlive absence. Halfway through dinner, my phone buzzed. A new message. From my father. "Congratulations on your event. I saw the coverage online. I hope you're well." I stared at it for a long moment. No demands, no guilt, no manipulation, just a few cautious words. The old me would have replied instantly, hungry for reconciliation. The woman I'd become chose differently. I typed slowly. "Thank you. I'm well. I hope you are too." And that was all. No door slammed, but no gate flung wide open either. Just space. Honest, measured space. After dinner, when everyone had left and the house was quiet again, I stepped out into the garden. The night air smelled of earth and lilacs, just like it always had. The stars overhead were the same ones Grandpa used to name for me, tracing constellations with a calloused finger. I sat on the edge of the old stone fountain, closed my eyes, and whispered, "We did it." And for once, I didn't mean surviving. I meant becoming. Months drifted by like pages turning. The foundation grew, partnerships with local schools, mentorship programs, even a new after-school art studio built in the renovated barn behind the house. Bennett Transit flourished too, still guided by Rose's practical brilliance and the company's shared profit model. We sponsored scholarships for the children of drivers and dispatchers, honoring the people who had helped build everything from the ground up. The press caught wind eventually. Teacher turned heir builds legacy of learning. Reporters called, hungry for headlines about betrayal and inheritance wars. I declined every interview. I told them, it's not my story. It's theirs. The students, the teachers, the people who keep showing up. Even Justin reached out again, this time with an apology, halting and awkward, but real. He'd taken a job at a startup in another state. He wrote, "I don't expect forgiveness, but I'm glad you're doing something good. Maybe that's what they wanted all along." I didn't answer immediately. When I finally did, it was simple. "Thank you. I'm well. I hope you are too." Maybe that was enough. A year to the day after the will reading, I returned to that same lawyer's office, not for conflict this time, but to sign the final documentation establishing the Bennett Foundation as a permanent endowment. Martin watched as I scrawled my signature on the last line. He said, "You've done what most families never manage. You've turned loss into light."
I smiled faintly. They did the hard part. I just followed their map. He closed the folder, the snap of its clasp final and satisfying. Eleanor and Howard would be proud. "I know," I said quietly, because for the first time, I am too. Outside, the city shimmered, busy, imperfect, alive. I walked to my car with a lightness I hadn't felt in a long time. I wasn't the frightened girl who'd once cried herself to sleep in this house. I was the keeper of something lasting, not just money or property, but legacy, purpose, and choice. And as I drove home toward the warm lights of the Bennett house, I realized that the story had never really been about inheritance at all. It had been about the courage to stand alone until you found the people and the strength that made standing together possible. If you've ever been forced to choose between doing what's right and keeping the peace, let this story remind you, peace bought with silence isn't peace at all. The moment you stand up for your values, even if it costs you everything familiar, you don't lose family, you find it. So tell me, have you ever had to walk away from those who didn't see your worth? Leave your story in the comments below, and if you believe that true wealth is measured in kindness, not currency, make sure to like, share, and subscribe.
Because sometimes the greatest revenge is not anger, it's legacy.